All right. Good afternoon to everybody. I know right at 4 o'clock, we see the numbers increasing. So everybody is joining in now. So just wanted to say thank you so much for joining into this webinar series that really is continuing the conversation on name, image, and likeness beyond educating athletes beyond personal branding. So I know we've got Chris Holtmann. Chris, welcome. Clark Kellogg. Just need to turn on your video, Clark. Welcome. There he is.
Guys, great to be with you all.
Excellent. And Courtney Altemus as well from TeamAltemus. So my name is Luke Fedlam. I am the founder of Anomaly Sports Group that focuses on educating athletes at all levels and also working with athletic administrators on how to best educate student athletes. And I just want to kick it over to Courtney Altemus from TeamAltemus.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks everyone for joining, and of course to Clark and Chris for joining us today. Really excited to talk to you guys about this. And just a quick recap from last week for anybody who wasn't able to join. You know, we talked personal branding. A lot of schools are coming out with a lot of talk about personal branding, which is incredibly important for name, image, and likeness. But we recognize that the education needs to go beyond that. And just, you know, as we talked about last week, the best personal brand, if it is not laid on a foundation of really strong legal and financial matters and a well-vetted team, can become worthless or even worse, a liability if people are not educated on how to do that. So we feel strongly that we're highly likely to set student athletes up to fail if we're not educating them beyond the personal branding. So Luke and I came together, collaborated on our curriculum. As we know, all things legal and financial get complicated quickly. We try to keep it simple. We all say hashtag DDMC, and it really is as simple as due diligence, decision-making, money, and contracts. And beyond that, we like to align the curriculum almost like a game, like a football game or a women's college basketball game in 4 quarters. So keep the process the same, a repeatable process that student athletes can go back to as they work through some of these complexities for name, image, and likeness. Luke?
Yeah, so when you think about decision-making as that second quarter, like Courtney had mentioned, decision-making is critical. We know that student athletes have a decision-making process for making split-second decisions within their sport. But sometimes they need to be able to slow that process down for decision-making outside of their sport and decisions that they have to make in life. And so we've created really a 4-step process for that to really work with athletes on REAP, this idea of REAP, because you reap what you sow, right? So this idea of recognizing the decision that has to be made, evaluating information, being able to analyze the options that are in front of you, and then ultimately P, producing a result. So that's the decision-making aspect of it.
Which rolls right into due diligence. We believe not only is it important to do due diligence on anyone's going to hire as part of their team, but first and foremost, use that decision-making process in the due diligence of self. Just because you're a collegiate student athlete doesn't mean you want to participate in name, image, and likeness. It's important to evaluate your goals. Do you want to leave with some savings, leave school with some savings? Do you want to leave with an education around being an entrepreneur? Do you want to make a ton of money? Do you want to bridge the gap between your partial scholarship and what's coming out of pocket? You need to answer those questions first and then consider all the responsibilities of name, image, and likeness and being able to perform at a high level as a student athlete and a student and be able to take it on. So very important to do self-due diligence before getting to the point of doing due diligence on advisors. And that is a separate process that draws from the same due diligence process, but it's so important to vet and understand who you're going to be hiring and who you need to hire and who you don't need to hire.
Yeah. And then do you want to talk about the financial aspect too with that, Courtney?
Sure. So money's hard for adults to manage, much less 18 and 19-year-old young adults, student athletes. We see it now, as I mentioned last week, with the full scholarship athletes with cost of attendance and anybody who qualifies beyond that for Pell Grants. Spending decisions are really, really hard. And we really believe student athletes should be going through a process, again, of goal setting, applying that goal setting process to budgeting. The main goal is keep financial distractions at a minimum, hopefully eliminate them. So again, the student athlete can perform in the classroom and in their sport. So very important basic financial literacy, budgeting. Taxes are going to become an issue, and most student athletes have not had to deal with that before. So many things, they don't know what they don't know, and they need to be taught.
Yeah. And so then the last thing we talked about last week, just to recap and before we move on, is this idea of contracts. And so this obviously is an area that's near and dear to my heart. So as a sports lawyer, I've looked at hundreds of different endorsement deals or agent agreement deals that players will sign with marketing agents and beyond. And it's really critical that these players have someone who can help them understand some of just the basic tenets of endorsement contracts, what to look for, and in certain instances, really to have someone who can be independent, who is not tied to the outcome of their decision or not tied to a percentage of a fee, to be able to review those contracts and help them understand what it is that's being put in front of them, which ultimately they may or may not sign their name to. So again, DDMC, kind of what we went into last week. But this week, we're excited to have two new perspectives to share with you. And so we've got Coach Holtmann, so excited that you're here, and Clark Kellogg. And Clark, as you're going to be moderating the discussion, I want to kick it over to you. And, sometimes people will say like, so this person needs no introduction. Well, you don't need an introduction, but I'm still going to give you a brief one anyway. Because Clark is just absolutely a known name in college sports. And when you look at all that he's done as CBS's league sports college basketball analyst for their studio, a lot of people don't know, though, that you also spent time with the Indianapolis Pacers. And when you look at the Indiana Pacers, the fact that you were on their broadcast team, but then also their vice president of player development and player relations, a lot of times people don't know that about your background. So I was wondering if maybe you could start off just by sharing with us some of the work that you did and what that looked like as you were working with individual players at that team level.
Yeah, well, thanks, Luke. Great to be here with you and Courtney and Coach Chris Holtmann. I'm really excited to have a chance to learn and hopefully shed some light on this new area of name, image, and likeness for those who are listening in. So thank you for having me. Yeah, I spent 32 years in total with the Pacers, 5 as a player, 23 as a broadcaster, and then the last 4, 2010 to 2014, I was in the role you described, Vice President of Player Relations. And really, it was about bringing players along in their off-the-court lives or keeping distractions to a minimum, educating them so they could enhance performance, not just between the lines, but hopefully be able to perform better when that transition takes place, once the ball stops bouncing and once they're no longer NBA players. So it was an area of programming, player development, connecting them to themselves and to resources, and really an area that I'm extremely passionate about, the whole empowering and education of young people in general, but particularly as it relates to student athletes and professional athletes. The empowerment that comes through education is really what I was doing as Vice President of Player Relations.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. And
well,
also,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Clark.
No, on you, Luke.
No, please. I insist. Absolutely. Go ahead.
No, well, actually, I'm really happy to have a chance to be part of this conversation and to be joined by the head men's basketball coach at Ohio State, Chris Holtmann. He and I actually go back to the late 2000s when he was an assistant coach at OU. Actually coached our oldest son briefly, Alex, and then recruited our youngest son, Nick, who ended up going to OU. So I've got a long relationship of respect and admiration and friendship with Chris Holtmann. So glad he's taken the time to be here. And we kind of pulled out a nugget from his bio that really resonated with all of us as we started thinking about our conversation. It comes from Jay Billis, a quote that Jay Billis said, "For Chris, winning is a byproduct of doing things the right way, and the cultures he has established in basketball programs that he's been part of really reflect that." So Chris, I want to welcome you with that quote, and then ask a quick question as we get our conversation started. You've been on record as being in favor of name, image, and likeness, NIL. You see this as an opportunity for student athletes to really enhance the value of their college experience. Could you go a little deeper and kind of give us more of your thoughts on NIL and the impact you think it might have on student athletes?
Sure will. Yeah, sure will. Great to be with you, Clark, Courtney, Luke, and all of our guests. It's an honor to be on with you. I do think it's a really good thing. I think, Clark, the bulk of college coaches believe that this is the direction that our game and college athletics is going and has needed to go. I think there's been pushback from some for sure, but I think when you look at just the general economy of college athletics in today's day and age, it certainly, I believe, warrants this opportunity for players to benefit off their name, image, and likeness. And I think it's going to have a significant impact, and perhaps more in some of the revenue-producing sports. But I don't think it's just going to be limited to those sports either, or those athletes either. I don't. I think it'll be open to a variety of sports, and what it's all going to look like, I don't know. I think, could you see social media's impact and the social media following of our student athletes play a major role in this? I believe that, whether it's a cameo production from one of our athletes or any number of other things, but I think it's going to have a significant impact for our athletes.
Yeah, I think that's a common theme too, Coach. Is this idea that it is going to be a significant impact, and I think a lot of times what people are trying to figure out is, what is that impact going to be? And I think, oftentimes, and this is why Courtney and I have had these conversations. We both care deeply about just the education of athletes, so that they can be protected, to be able to have a positive impact on themselves, their families, and their communities. It's a matter of figuring out what is that impact going to be, and how to help, especially in this transition into this new universe of name, image, and likeness, how to help, best educate these players to be able to be prepared to manage that change that's coming, that significant impact that's coming.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think too, Chris, when you talk about how it's going to have a significant impact and yet to be seen what that looks like, I do believe it's going to have a widespread impact. There may be student athletes making $1,000 extra a semester, or $10,000 or $50,000 extra a semester, depending on who it is and what they choose to participate in. Regardless of how much money they're making, they need the same education. So basically everything that has met professional athletes when they step away from the college game is now going to meet the student athlete at age 18. And I think it's incumbent upon the schools to make sure that those field hockey players are getting the same education for name, image, and likeness as the full scholarship men's football and basketball players. And I think that, that's going to be a huge shift, as well as making sure all the same resources get out there. And, I mentioned this last week. Initially, a lot of women that I know in collegiate athletics were hesitant and thinking this was going to create an even larger divide between the gender in sports. I may be a little bit over positive, but I think it's actually going to help. And some of the studies I talked about last week actually, support that idea. And I think it's great, but we've got to make sure everybody's educated.
Yeah. Clark, I know you're the moderator, but allow me to at least play, reporter here for a second and interview you on that. What are your thoughts, right? I mean, kind of same question, right? If you think about, name, image, and likeness, how do you see it playing out, and how do you see the potential, kind of significant impact that Coach was talking about? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I first think that this is clearly the right direction to go in consideration of the landscape we're in with the economy of college athletics, to give the student athlete an opportunity to do what any student would have the chance to do if in fact he or she had some marketability or some name, image, and likeness potential. It shouldn't be a hindrance because you're on scholarship. That shouldn't be something that should be taken away from you as a student. I go back to my days. I was recruited in 1979. I'd actually gone through all of the right protocol to get my property and casualty insurance license as an 18-year-old. One of my mentors and still a dear friend, an Ohio State grad, befriended me during my recruitment. I worked in his insurance agency, thought about that as a viable business opportunity for me whenever I got done with school. And if in fact basketball didn't work out on the pro side, or even if it did, maybe a career path afterwards. But because of me being on scholarship, the NCAA actually investigated me at that time because they deemed that I might have an unfair advantage because of my notoriety. And that's exactly what we're talking about now. And it's part and parcel. Obviously, the university plays a big role in the branding of an individual that's a scholarship student athlete. I mean, the power and magnitude of The Ohio State University, the strength of its athletic programs, the size of this market, the strength of the following locally, regionally, nationally, and worldwide as a Buckeye. Those things come into play. But again, you shouldn't be kept from having the opportunity to leverage that because you're on scholarship. So I'm excited to see how this plays out. And the educational component is really critical. And institutions being proactive in making sure that they're approaching this in terms of empowerment. And so with that said, I'd like to segue into my next question for Chris. And obviously, this is a great opportunity. We don't know what it's going to look like or how it's going to play out, what the regulations and parameters will be. But we know it's a really good opportunity for education and for monetizing one's name, image, and likeness. The flip side of that, though, with every opportunity, there are challenges and potential risks. Chris, have you given any thought to that side of the equation in terms of how you're looking at it as a coach? What might be some of the things that concern you as we go down this road?
Yeah, I have, Clark, and I think there are things that I think of that I don't know if they're honestly legitimate concerns or not, because it's such a fluid situation in terms of what it's all going to look like. But, you know, as a coach, you worry to some degree about time demands. I've heard that as we've talked about it as a staff, what's going to be the time demands on our student athletes. But I also think that, you know what, your athletes will figure that out. They will figure it out, and they're not going to miss a practice because they have some type of an engagement that they have to get to. So I think there can be communication there. I think, you know, you could see in recruiting some pre-negotiated endorsement deals, plans in place, what's all that going to look like? That's not necessarily, I think, from my understanding, within the rules. Kind of what's the market value and how is that going to be monitored? Is there going to be large increases in a recruiting advantage that doesn't fit the actual market value? I'm not sure if I'm making sense there or not. And then I think, you know, is there, you know, I think for a general athletic department, do you see less of a contribution maybe to athletic departments from your boosters because you see them more involved in committing to players? That's not necessarily my concern, but I've thought about that. So those are some things.
Yeah, and then as you've recruited, as you've actually, this is coming, and as you've gone about recruiting, have you modified your approach or added anything to it in light of what's coming down the road with NIL?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We've had conversations with some, as we've gotten further along with certain recruits. We have very much had conversations. The specifics, we've got away from specifics, but we have a presentation prepared for every student athlete, in the prior years. Basically, here is what you are receiving as a men's basketball recruit at Ohio State. And it includes obviously everything. Their room and board and tuition and the stipend, the cost of attendance stipend. We had a student athlete here before the NCAA offered the stipend that in his 4 years saved $20,000.
Wow.
From his experience. Now, he was way more thrifty than I was at that age.
Yeah, me too.
A much better steward of money, but he cleared almost 20,000 from just being, that was before the cost of attendance. So
Yeah.
this NIL will add a huge kind of addendum to that presentation on the resources available.
Yeah, excellent.
And I just want to dig on that for a second, Coach, because, let me say this too. If you have questions for the panel, we're gonna open up to questions here in about 15, 20 minutes or so. So feel free to put them in through the chat or put them in through the Q&A button below. But one question that did actually already come in that really hits to that piece that you're talking about around recruiting, Coach, which is around this idea of concerns. Do you have any concerns that exist around recruiting as it relates to kind of name, image, and likeness and sharing name, image, and likeness kind of thoughts and everything when the NCAA necessarily hasn't been clear because the rules haven't been finalized yet? So there's a timing kind of thing where you've got to recruit, right? So you've got to go out and get players, and clearly this is something that's kind of straight out of the headlines. But do you have concerns around trying to explain something that isn't even kind of finalized yet?
I do. I just think we've had to be more general in nature, Luke, in how we've talked about it with recruits. And it's hard to be really we've tried to stay away from too many specifics. And even if we've gotten asked that, and we've not got probed a whole lot by families, but I think we will in the coming year. But we've tried to be really general. And when we know more specifics, we'll try to give them. So we have maybe given them some specific examples of, hey, this is how we potentially envision it.
Mm-hmm.
But we spoke in generalities more than anything.
Yeah. No, that's good.
Yeah, and I just wanted to go back to a little bit of what you talked about before, Chris. Warms my heart to hear about student athletes saving money. But one of the things that we see, because they are competitors, once you get them excited about something, they dive in. I mean, they start saving in an account. There's so many great apps now where they can put in $7 a week and watch it grow. And they get very excited because they're competing with themselves. Did they meet their budget this month? If they didn't, why? If they went over, what do they need to cut back on next month? And then you add, a little bit of interest, which is just a tiny little bit of interest these days, but some of them get enough money to start investing in more and they get really into it. So it's Clark, to your point, that empowerment piece, getting them to understand that this opportunity is there and getting excited about it and teaching them how to do it.
And Chris, I'd like to visit with you too. You mentioned in one of your recent comments around the educational value of this type of experience being added to the student athlete experience. As you've been in the coaching game for a number of years now, what are some of the challenges you find in trying to educate players in these areas, not just between the lines, but I know you have a holistic approach. Is there anything that kind of stands out in your experience around the hurdles in terms of educating players? And maybe I'll narrow it down to maybe the money management or time management, any of those things that kind of jump out at you as you think about it?
Yeah. I think that so money management, I think for all of us is it's hard. It's a process. I think for all of us have had to learn, in some cases the hard way. But we have, as we have realized that our players have the potential to both earn and accrue more money, we felt like an obligation, honestly, to their moms and their dads to say, okay, hey, let us bring in someone that can help you talk about a budget and talk about a good use of your money and talk about how your money, if you invest it properly, can be utilized long term. So we have done that every off season. We did that in the past. We're going to do it even more now. We're going to ramp that education up. Now, that does not mean that they're not going to go and buy a new pair of shoes.
Yeah, right.
And use it in ways that maybe but I do think it's incumbent upon us to educate them at the highest level, because they do have the potential to have money that, and we all know in college, $1,000 is, I mean, it's a lot of money anyway, but it's a lot of money in college.
Mm-hmm.
I think that educational piece, which we can do as coaches, but someone else from the outside can come and do a much better job than we can. So we're going to continue to build that. That's a part of us, as you said, the holistic education.
Yeah, and that's really good to hear that you and your staff are being proactive. I know Gene Smith, the athletic director, as well, is all about education and empowering the athletes, and I'm really excited about that component. But it is something that institutions have to prioritize, in addition to the work you guys do, obviously between the lines, which is the core mission when you're doing what you do.
And I think something that goes along with what Coach said, right? It's the practical education, right?
Yeah.
When you think about this holistic approach, right, and having that education at the highest level, Courtney and I both, kind of do presentations and engage in educational opportunities with different organizations. And the one thing that you can tell when you're really focused on trying to educate young people is making it real, right? If I can make this real for you, then you're much more likely to want to engage in the conversation, engage in the dialogue, ask questions, and take something away from it. And so one of the things that we see a lot of, especially in this name, image, and likeness conversations that we're having, and I know Courtney can talk about it from the financial side, but when I talk about contracts and understanding like what an endorsement deal even is, right? A lot of times we're having this conversation on name, image, and likeness about, being able to license your name, your image, and your likeness to something, and people don't even know what that actually means, right? And how there's a contract that has aspects to it that mean you have to do certain things and the brand has to do certain things. And being able to have conversations around the realities of what that looks like, successful conversations, athletes who've made smart decisions in that regard, athletes who have been, signed a poor agreement or have been taken advantage of by an agreement that wasn't fully understood. That to me is like a way that you really can kind of kick in the education piece in a way that players can relate to, because it's now real to them and it helps them understand what they really may be experiencing as time goes on.
Absolutely. And I think, it's so important, especially for student athletes and at their age and what they're doing in life, to engage them whether we're doing a virtual session or we're in person. If we're in person, the student athletes aren't in their chairs for more than 2 minutes at the beginning of our workshops, because we want them up, competing, having fun, engage, and they don't even realize what they're learning until after they sit down. And to your point, Luke, it is the practical lesson. We try to keep everything relatable to what they're doing every single day. So whether that's analogies about game plans, analogies about studying, or how they're going to use it in their life, we continue to drive that home because we want them to understand this is part of your daily habits, and it needs to become habitual so that you're practicing it just like you practice craft, just like when you go into the weight room. We want to make sure that it's repeatable, it's understandable. So that relatability piece is huge, and putting it in their language. And one other thing we like to do, it's our mantra: athletes and money, only positive stories. As a former financial advisor on Wall Street, I just kept thinking there's got to be a better way to do this. We've got so many negative stories out there, and while they're powerful stories, and you can definitely see a shift in a student athlete's eyes and their body language when they're hearing these stories, we just felt like there wasn't a lot of education around what are the tools to avoid those. We tell them, don't do this, don't end up like this person, but we're not necessarily giving them the tools. So, that again, practical, relatable, repeatable education is really important.
Yeah, and I wanted to pick up on that, Courtney, in terms of the repeatable nature of this kind of education. What have you seen that is best practice in terms of repetition and reinforcement of this kind of education? Because I think that'll be significant and important, in addition to helping the student athletes understand that they are there and on scholarship because of their particular sport, and to make sure order of priority is tied to get to, for their particular sport and to get an education. Part of the education has this other layer of NIL on it now, but primarily the driver is their sport and their education, and making sure that doesn't get improperly prioritized, if you will.
Exactly, exactly. You know, one of the things that we did when we first started was, if we were doing a budgeting workshop, we send every student athlete a link to a budgeting form prior to the workshop. So they're sending their numbers in, and we kick it back out in a budget format before the workshop, with the idea being that they're gonna watch as we're working through this workshop, and they're looking at their income and expenses, and they're realizing along the way they've miscategorized things, they didn't understand a calculation. And so we sort of teach from the very beginning from their shoes, you know?
Yeah.
And so the repeatable piece becomes interesting to them because it's about their budget. So, you know, we don't just go in and do a workshop and give them a bunch of concepts and leave. You know, the follow-up to that is making sure we have check-in. Correct, and then they use whatever tool they want to use, but they're implementing. And now we're developing some micro-learning lessons to help as they go through after, especially now that we don't know if they're going to be, when they're going to be back on campus full time. You know, just 3 to 7 minute sessions, just drilling those concepts. It's right on their phone. It's, you know, gamified. It's so important. And it becomes, like I said earlier, as it relates to budgeting, you know, kind of fun. They compete with themselves, and then, you know, continue to get those messages and continue to reinforce the thing that we've taught.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's good. So I guess, you know, if we look to both of you who have kind of been in this space in different respects, you know, we'll start off with you, Coach Holtmann, and then we'll head over to Clark. You know, what do you foresee as being some of the easiest concepts for student athletes to grasp, and maybe some of the more challenging concepts for athletes to grasp, kind of given what we're seeing that name, image, and likeness is going to start to look like? So as you kind of, you know, forecast out to what, I know you said broad strokes before, but as you start to think about what this means for your athletes, what are some of the things that you feel like might be easy for them to kind of to grasp, but then also a challenge?
Yeah, I think the easiest part is, hey, I can get paid for doing some of the things that I got opportunities maybe to do in the past and had to turn down. I think that's the easiest thing for them to comprehend right now, whether that's autograph signing while they're a student athlete. We talked about a cameo production. We all know our student athletes are way more informed and educated on all the avenues of social media than at least I am. They're coaches, that's for sure. They have a much greater feel for, I think, the market potential for some of those things than I would. So I think that's the easiest. I think, although I don't even know if this is hardest, you know, the reality is that not everyone will be treated the same. We understand that, but the locker room also understands marketplace value, just in a different way. Not everybody receives the same amount of playing time. Some are rewarded more playing time based on their ability and their talent and their work ethic and those kind of things. So there is an understanding there probably in a locker room that not everybody will be treated the same way, and that's certainly true in the marketplace. You know, I do think they'll have to understand that there's some specifics, like your marketability is really based on your personal brand, as opposed to, it can be attached to your school. Obviously, people know the starting quarterback, the starting point guard, but it's right. It cannot be this logo, right? I think we understand those things. So I think there is a personal branding that I think that players will have to learn.
No, I agree 100% with that. Clearly, fair is not equal.
Yeah.
You know that if you have children, you know that. If you have a team, you know that, just as you indicated, Chris. I mean, hey, fair is not always going to be equal. It'll be fair, but it may be different. And that understanding, I think, will be one that could be a hurdle for some young student athletes, just because of where they are in their development and in their journeys. They see the bright lights of potential name, image, and likeness and tend to gravitate towards those who have the biggest brand and the biggest reach. And that's not the reality for the vast majority for a lot of different reasons. So I think that'll be one of the educational components that will have to be really hit home. And it'll come pretty quick once this thing plays out. And athletes are pretty honest for the most part. When they see what the reality is, they accept it. But that'll be one hurdle, I think, that'll be a challenge. And I'm hopeful that the discussion will, and this one has been really good. I listened to last week's, and I know Seth Greenberg talked a lot about some of the outliers and some of the negative influences that could possibly try to gravitate towards some of these kids. And that goes on. But I would hope we'd frame it from the standpoint of education, empowering, and life skills. So that, again, this is another opportunity to grow in real life skills that are going to be necessary if you go on to have a professional career in your sport. And more importantly, if you don't. These are things that you should begin to understand when it relates to your personal brand, because we all have one. We all have one. The magnitude of it may be different, but each of us has some level of personal brand, and there's some universal basic things that go into making that brand a good one. And this should be part of the education for these student athletes. And I'm kind of excited about that component as we move forward.
Well, that's interesting, because I think, everyone does have their brand. Everyone has their personal brand. We know that, like Coach said, not everyone is going to be treated equally. Coach Clark, from your perspectives, one of the things I feel like that's not talked a lot about in name, image, and likeness is the idea of entrepreneurship, right? And ownership of something that maybe you haven't been able to do in the past. So we hear a lot of conversation around, endorsement deals and the elite getting deals and things like that. But there's this other aspect that says, hey, heretofore you maybe haven't been able to have a business that you've created, or something that you're interested in. How do you see that aspect kind of playing out in this name, image, and likeness world, right? This idea of an athlete that says, you know what, I love basketball, and I love, doing, my coursework, but at the same time, I may not be the most, well-known player. I might be the third or fourth guy off the bench, but I sure do like, I don't know, fashion, or I like the idea of creating widgets or whatever that might be. Kind of, how do you see that playing out in this potential new world of name, image, and likeness opportunity?
Clark, you want to go on that first?
Yeah, I will. It's interesting, Luke. There was a time when I was playing, I go way back, where during the summer you had those kinds of networking work opportunities. Now things have become so year-round, particularly in the revenue-generating sports, that I think student athletes sometimes miss out on some of the life skills development that would take place if you weren't so dedicated and committed year-round to your sport. I understand that's where many of these athletes want to be, but part of the holistic approach to the education is to have room and time for self-discovery. And part of that is academic, but a lot of it may be not academic and not your sport, but the window of time. I think this particular area will perhaps indirectly move us towards that type of at least exposure and experience again for student athletes. I really do, because I had a summer job every summer that I was in school at Ohio State for 3 years. I worked with the insurance agent that I told you about earlier. And I learned some unbelievable lessons. I wasn't with my teammates. I wasn't practicing. I had 6-8 weeks off. And then when I reconvened in the fall, we were at it. I did my work during the off season while I was working my job. And I learned some unbelievable lessons around business, the insurance business and other businesses. Many student athletes don't have that opportunity because of summer school and commitments to their sport. So I think this may, in some indirect way, because it requires some understanding, connecting, being aware of what networking might be like, what an endorsement opportunity might look like, who this person is that may desire you to be at an autograph signing. Is there something about what they do or who they are that might interest you, and you might be. So I think some of this might kind of organically happen, and I think it's healthy. I mean, I think it can be good. It's going to be a challenging dynamic, because it's going to require some relinquishing of control and some changing of the landscape. But I tend to lean towards it helping students maybe to broaden out a little bit with the help of, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, go ahead. Clark, I'm sorry. I completely agree. I think the broadening of interest is only a good thing for students and for student athletes. I don't ever look at it as a negative. You know, we had kids in our locker room last year that thought about doing a t-shirt business. Now they had to run it through compliance, but I never looked at that and said, well, that's taking them away from gym time. You know, I've had people say to me right now, with some of the civic minded things that our student athletes are doing in terms of protest, was that going to take away some of their, not in the least. I don't have the least bit of concern. As a matter of fact, I'm on the other side of that. I think it's a great exercise in them growing as people and utilizing their minds and their bodies to speak something that is meaningful to them. Yeah. And we encourage it, just like we'll encourage the entrepreneurial spirit with our players. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's really important. You know, every program we work with, I said it last week, you don't get into college athletics for the money. As you progress, you have an opportunity to possibly make good money, but everybody that we work with at every school is there because they want to make an impact in students' lives, and they want to help them develop in life outside of their sport and outside of the classroom. And I agree with both of you. I think that now the opportunity to grow those interests and the opportunity to have it happen at 18 or 19 is going to make them that much more prepared when they leave school. I mean, we see, especially in some of the Power 5 conferences, these lavish facilities, and student athletes don't really have to do anything for themselves. They work really hard. But in terms of practical life skills, day to day, I'm definitely not running a business or being an entrepreneur. They just aren't faced with the challenges. And so they are not as prepared as they need to be. And I think, you know, to the social piece of it and being able to use the platform. I mean, it's because we work with professional and student athletes, and we talk so much with professional athletes about their platform and what do they want to do with it? What good do they want to do with it? How much do they want to spend on money-making opportunities versus community building opportunities? And I think, you know, each school has its own vision, its own mission. It wants better representation out in the community. And I think there's a great opportunity for that, to help those student athletes also use their voices and try to help. So I think it's, you know, money is going to play a huge role. But again, the process of any way there are going to be opportunities for money, they can also be applying to helping a cause they care about or helping a community.
That's good. That's good. So time, like every week, flies by. So I want to make sure that we get to some of the questions of the people who have joined us, and we've got a bunch of them that have already come in. So I'm going to take the first one just because it's a little bit more legal in nature. Then I'm going to kick around some other questions here. So if you do have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A or use the chat function to send us some questions. One question that came in was around Title IX, and it was a question around how their concerns with how Title IX is going to be impacted in this new name, image, and likeness world. And the person who submitted the question will be disappointed to see women be in a non-equitable situation. From my perspective, I think we've heard it here just in the diversity of the opportunities that may present themselves. I think that this is going to be something where both men and women student athletes are going to have opportunities to abound in different ways, through appearances, through kind of autographs or networking opportunities, but also more specifically from the entrepreneurship piece. We and Courtney, I know we've had conversations about this too, but even when you look at UCLA, women's gymnastics, and there are different teams out there that have incredible social media following and impact, that I think that we're going to see opportunities really abound. And I think more specifically, we have to remember too that it's about brands, right? It's about brands, and it's about, companies out there who can identify people who meet their demographic or meet the target demographic that they have. And I think we're going to see, I don't know that we'll necessarily see some immediate Title IX type of issues. I think that we'll actually see opportunities that will exist for both men's and women's sports. Another question that came in, Chris, this one is for you. Do you see transfers increasing if schools oversell name, image, and likeness opportunities in the recruiting process that don't end up coming to fruition? Especially if transfer rules change and students no longer have to serve a year in residence. I know you touched on that briefly, that you're going with the broad strokes. Others might be trying to recruit with an edge and be more narrow. So how do you see that playing out if opportunities at the name, image, and likeness perspective don't come to fruition?
Certainly, I think that's a real possibility, that you could see players exploring different options. I think the player mobility is probably only going to increase with the rule change that is somewhat imminent. We think, and no longer a year in residence. But I think, just like anything, if something is promised in recruiting and it's not delivered upon, players, there's going to be a lack of trust there. So I think it's incumbent upon us as coaches probably to be general and maybe a little more cautious on the front end in how we're selling this. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like right now. Specific dollar figures for sure. We just don't. So to say otherwise, I would think a student athlete and his family might be a little bit leery if there's an over-promising, just like honestly they are if you're over-promising in terms of playing time or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So another question that came in, and we'll start with Clark and then come back to Coach on this question. It's this idea of managing team members who use platforms to report insider information to bolster their social media followership, to bolster their opportunities. The reporting of that can have, both intentional and unintentional consequences. And kind of the thought of, especially Clark, with you kind of seeing it both, back when you were, with the Pacers, but also at the college level, kind of how might team rules vary across teams and institutions as it relates to that sharing potentially of information?
Well, I think there's a certain sacredness to the locker room, to the team, to the institution that will continue to exist and has to exist. I mean, there are just some lines that you don't cross in regards to seeking to gain access. We as broadcasters are always desiring more access to the players, to the coaches, particularly at the collegiate level. It's more the coaches than the players. But nonetheless, there are lines you don't cross, and there's a sacredness to elements of the locker room and that group and that team that I think most athletes are going to be conscious of not violating, and there will be rules in place, I think, to keep them from violating that. But there will be opportunities for agreed upon access. I mean, we've seen some of it just in the last several years with behind the scenes looks, some of our confidential features we do for CBS during the Final Four, where a coach and an institution have given our camera folks and feature producers access to team meals and locker room talks and those kinds of things. I think there's going to continue to be that hunger and desire for raw, real, authentic content between the lines, between the ropes, whatever it might be. And as long as that can be done in a fair way, but I think there are boundaries that'll be drawn, and those will continue to exist.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. I think most people will, I mean, that's a big no-no now in the locker room. Guys know that. I think that Clark said it right. It's sacred. To the questioner's question, though, I do think it's legitimate that you will see potential for players looking for ways to increase their following in whatever ways they can, because they know a vehicle towards benefiting from this is going to be social media driven in a lot of ways. So, I've recruited guys that have not been really interested in engaging in social media. It's refreshing when you have that, because it's rare. I'm not sure we'll see many of those, if any, exist anymore, especially if they see this as an avenue.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So I want to go to Courtney next with this next question, and then Clark, I'd love your perspective on this as well. So advisor selection, right? So there's this idea then that that these student athletes will be able to have an advisor, whether that's a marketing agent or whatever the name, the title ends up becoming. How do you begin to educate and engage a 17, 18, 19-year-old on selecting someone that they're hiring to potentially represent them in certain ways? How do you educate them through that process? And Clark, the follow-up to you is going to be, having been in that space, how do you as that player think about vetting, advisors, especially when you're so early in your career?
Yeah.
It's a great question. And it's really why I started the business, because as a financial advisor, when I was on Wall Street, it was frustrating to see when I would meet with prospective clients who were athletes, see them choose somebody else who I knew wasn't the right fit. And I realized over time, we all sound the same. So that is the reason I started the company initially, to help players vet financial advisors. And once I released my licenses, so I have no connections to anybody anywhere, and no biases. I'm truly on the same side of the table as the client, whether that be a student athlete or a professional athlete. So using my expertise, I developed a methodology around performing due diligence on advisors. Now that it's extended into collegiate athletes, we've been working with elite athletes at schools, those who are projected to go to a draft or an Olympic sport and possibly make some money. We've helped them, but now that it's broadening, we've reached even further. We take that initial due diligence of self process and apply it to the teams that they're going to need to choose. And we start with, who are all these people calling you? What are their roles? And who do you need to hire? Because typically off the bat, there's not that many people they need to hire, but they may have 10 different kinds of advisors calling and saying, you have to choose me, you need me for this, you need me for that, and they tend to try to scare them. So we first tell them that they have to decide who they need to hire for their personal situation. They need an inbound advisor management system, and it needs to be managed by somebody other than them, somebody they trust, because they have to focus on being a student and an athlete. And then we get into the protocols around how they run a first level due diligence screen on these people, and then into the interview process. So, when we're working with student athletes and we're in a group setting, we'll conduct mock interviews and help them. And so, there's a broad-based methodology and repeatable process that applies to every type of advisor, whether it's an agent or a marketing rep or a financial advisor. And then because of our expertise, we dig deep into the financial advisors and really help them analyze all the way to the end when it's time for them to make a decision.
Yeah, and something you said last week, Courtney, I heard you talk about trying to include families in some of the education when you have some of those elite athletes that are headed down that road. I was really fortunate. My mom and dad were really close to me and guided me and helped me. I had my mentor, who I mentioned, Ira Novak, in the insurance business, was also a really good help. And so my circle was pretty tight and trustworthy, but I know that's not the reality for many. But I would, my navigation advice for somebody whose situation may be different is really, I love the self-discovery piece and helping student athletes. And it's hard when you're so young, but to have people that are objective and really interested in asking you to think through some things that you can handle at your age. Do I want to be with a big firm? Do I want to be with somebody? Some of those questions that get to a level of self-discovery. I think that's really important. And then hopefully you have some people in your circle that you can lean into that can also go along on the educational journey with you, that you trust, and then you begin to build on that as you look at specific advisors. But having a couple of core people, it's nice if it's your mom and dad or your mom or somebody you've known for a while that'll walk the educational journey with you. I think that for many would be a way to try to approach it in this day and age.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you brought up the family piece, Clark, because Not only is it so important for those that the student athletes trust around them to be educated, but they're all hearing the same thing. So that process gets reinforced. And if somebody starts to miss a step in the process or hasn't asked a question, it's just so important. And a lot of times, we always say they don't know what they don't know. Right. So they might know questions 1, 2, and 3, but they don't know questions 1A through D. And depending on what the answers are, what to ask next. So it's critical and really important that they have, they had a team when they were choosing a college, most likely. It's important to have a team around this decision as well.
Exactly.
And I got to say, being a lawyer, I got to say, you also have to have somebody look at the contract. You got to understand what you're signing. I can't stress that enough. Like, I oftentimes when I talk with student athletes who are transitioning from college into the pros, and oftentimes what they do is they go through this process of like doing the due diligence and figuring out who they're going to go with. And once they make that decision, then that agent or that marketing agent or whoever says, okay, great, here are my contracts for you to sign. And then they go ahead and just sign the contracts. I'm like, whoa, like you have to understand what it is that you're signing. Even if you've in your gut done your due diligence and you feel like this is who I want to go with. I know that I've vetted them. We've done all the due diligence and all that kind of stuff. You still want to make sure that those agreements that you're actually signing with them are set up to give you the best protections possible, right? And I think, we've seen that just even in Zion Williamson and that, whole situation that he's going through and whatnot. So again, understanding what those agreements say. All right, we're running out of time. Coach Holtmann, here's a question for you. You touched on it briefly earlier about the locker room dynamics. How do you, as a coach, manage that? It's been, different just based on what media has said for players, saying that, equity and that they're, one player wants, has more interviews than, let's say, another player. But now when it starts to be that one player is making more money and potentially significantly more money than other players, how do you manage that locker room dynamic?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think you're going to have to talk about it. I think there's no question. It's going to have to be a conversation you're going to have. You're going to have to explain to them that this is an introduction into what real life looks like. If they go to the NBA, not everybody's going to get the same contract in the NBA. If, not everybody's going to have the same starting salary their first year out in college. So, not every college coach makes the same amount of money. So I think it is going to be the team dynamic to the person's question. I think the team dynamic is could it be challenged more because you're now bringing potential for more money, and more money, more problems sometimes, right? Potentially bringing more money into the situation. It could. I think that team dynamic could be stressed a little more. It's stressed in terms of how strong is it. I think it's going to be upon us as coaches in terms of who we recruit, the kind of people we have in our locker room, and what their goals are.
No, that's good. Okay, last question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Courtney.
I just wanted to add really quickly. It struck me as you were talking, Coach. There's every person on your team has a role. You don't just have, a starting 5 and then the rest of the guys sitting on the bench just as practice players. They all have a role, and sometimes their biggest role is in the locker room. So I think, being able to continue, you're so focused on culture, I think it will be a healthy dialogue, because some of those guys who never step foot on the court during a game, unless you're up by 20 and there's 30 seconds left, they might be making more money than anybody, because they may have some talent off the court, and that's probably going to be hard in an opposite direction. So I think you're right. I think a lot of dialogue, I think, will help that, and it'll be a great growth opportunity for the team and the culture.
Yep.
It's 4:59, so I want to ask one last super quick question. Coach and Clark, if you could answer this. We've gotten a few questions, and I'm going to try to just assimilate them into like one general question, which is basically, how do you help keep your players focused on their sport and their academics, knowing that this is going on, so that they're not out chasing, deals, chasing endorsement opportunities, and missing out on their development as a player and their development in that classroom?
For me, it's simple. First things first. And again, You're there because you earned the scholarship through your athletic ability there. You're there to get an education. That has to be your highest priority. Some of the benefits that come out of that have to be secondary and tertiary. That's as simple as it is for me. First things first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. It is try to help our guys understand the end game. What is the end game? We want this college experience here at Ohio State to benefit them long term, not in the immediate, in the long term. How do we best help them do that? How do we best help them understand that?
That's great. That's great. Listen, time flies, but it's 5 o'clock on the dot, so we did it. Thank you all so very much. Thank you to Clark. Thank you, Coach Holtmann. On behalf of TeamAltemus and Anomaly Sports Group, thank you all for joining in. Like I said, we will get the recording out, so you'll have the recording here in the next few days. And please do tune in next week in our final installment of this webinar series. We're going to be looking at student-athlete development and compliance, and so really digging into that aspect of name, image, and likeness. So again, thank you all for tuning in. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Appreciate it. Enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you.
All right.